Picture this. It's 1965. The NHRA's factory experimental class is the hottest thing in American motorsport. Factories are spending millions. The best drivers in the country are lined up. Fans are packed into the stands. And then before a single car even gets to make a full pass, NHRA officials walk through the paddock, take one look at what's sitting there, and ban 5 cars on the spot. Not one car, not 2, 5 cars. Gone. Done. In a single ruling. Now here's what makes this story so fascinating. None of these cars were banned for cheating. Nobody had hidden a turbocharger under a hood or snuck nitrous into a fuel line. These cars were exactly what the manufacturers said they were. They were built exactly the way the teams described them. And NHRA still looked at them and said, no, you cannot race these. Not here. Not in our competition. So what were these cars? Why did 5 of them get banned at the same time? And what actually happened after NHRA showed them the door? That's exactly what we're getting into today, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you're going to understand why 1965 was the single most chaotic, most controversial, most fascinating season in drag racing history. Stay with me. Now, let's look at each of these 5 cars individually, because each one has its own story, its own technology, its own driver, and its own legacy. Car number 1, the 1965 Plymouth Belvedere A990 altered wheelbase. The Plymouth Belvedere AWB was in many ways the car that started the panic at NHRA headquarters. When Ronnie Sox showed up with his Hemi-powered, altered wheelbase Belvedere, the reaction from officials was immediate. This did not look like any Plymouth that had ever come out of a dealership. It was visually strange. The front wheels sat dramatically further forward than they were supposed to, almost behind the front bumper. The rear wheels had moved up toward the middle of the car. The proportions were all wrong by normal automotive standards, and that was entirely by design. The car started life as what Chrysler internally called a 990 Mule, a specially prepared base vehicle built specifically for racing. Every A990 started with a body that had already been lightened. Acid dipping was used on many of these cars, a process where the body panels are literally dipped in acid to eat away metal and reduce weight without compromising structural integrity. The front fenders, hood, bumpers, and other components were replaced with lightweight alternatives. The windows were replaced with thinner glass or plexiglass. Every ounce that could be removed was removed. Then came the axle work. The rear axle moved forward by 15 inches, the front by 10. The result was a car that, even with the heavy 426 Hemi sitting in the engine bay, had 56% of its weight sitting over the rear tires. That weight distribution, combined with the massive torque output of the race-tuned Hemi, meant these cars could put their power down in a way that nothing else on the strip could match. In its initial configuration with dual 4-barrel carburation, Dick Landy, who was perhaps the most technical of all the Mopar AWB pilots, was running elapsed times in the 10.20 second range at speeds approaching 138 miles per hour. Those were extraordinary numbers for 1965. For context, the quickest production-based cars of the era were running in the low 11s. A 10.20 from a car with a full steel body was almost incomprehensible. Chrysler then authorized a switch to Hilborn fuel injection mid-season, and the elapsed times improved further. Cars were now running in the mid-9 second range at over 140 miles per hour. In a full-bodied car in 1965. These numbers were so far ahead of anything else in the class that NHRA's decision to ban them, while controversial, was at least understandable from a competitive standpoint. Ronnie Sox drove his Belvedere AWB with a precision that nobody else could match. Sox was already legendary for his ability to shift a 4-speed transmission under full power, a skill that sounds simple, but is extraordinarily difficult to execute consistently when you're trying to control a 9-second, 140-mile-per-hour monster. When NHRA showed him the door, Sox didn't pack up and go home. He took the car to the match race circuit, and we'll talk about what happened there a little later. The Plymouth Belvedere AWB remains one of the most historically significant drag racing machines ever built. It was the car that forced NHRA to rewrite its rulebook and, in doing so, accidentally launched an entirely new category of motorsport, Car number 2, the 1965 Dodge Coronet altered wheelbase. If the Plymouth AWB was the one that got the attention, the Dodge Coronet AWB was its twin, equally fast, equally radical, and equally unwelcome at NHRA events once the new wheelbase rules came down. The Coronet AWB was mechanically identical to the Belvedere AWB. Same axle relocations 15 inches in. The rear, 10 in the front. Same a 990 construction process. Same race-tuned 426 Hemi engine. The only real difference was the body. The Coronet used the Dodge Coronet shell rather than the Plymouth Belvedere, which gave it a slightly different roofline and slightly different proportions, but underneath and in terms of performance, they were the same car. The Dodge cars were distributed to the Dodge factory racing teams, with Dick Landy being the most prominent of the AWB Coronet pilots. Landy was known as the Charger, a nickname that reflected his aggressive, technically precise driving style. He was not just a driver, he was an engineer. Landy could tune a Hemi engine to a level that most mechanics couldn't even understand, and his input on the development of the AWB cars was significant. When Landy showed up with his radically altered Coronet at early season events, the reaction from other competitors was a mixture of awe and fury. The Ford camp, which had been counting on the 427 SOHC engine to give them a decisive advantage, was not at all happy about the Chrysler response. Ford mounted a serious public relations campaign against the AWB Mopars, arguing that Chrysler had gone too far, that these cars were no longer even remotely related to anything a customer could buy, and that NHRA needed to do something about it. Ford was not entirely wrong in that argument. The AWB Coronets and Belvederes had started life as production cars. Technically, but by the time Chrysler's engineers were finished with them, the connection to anything available at a Dodge dealership was essentially theoretical. The wheelbase alteration alone made them unrecognizable. The acid-dipped body panels, the plexiglass windows, the race-only Hemi tune, none of this was something a customer would ever encounter. NHRA, caught between two angry factory teams and a competitive situation that was getting completely out of hand, responded with the 2% wheelbase rule. And just like that, F it. Landis Coronet, which had been turning in those same stunning sub 10.20 times, was out of NHRA competition. What's remarkable about the Coronet AWB is how quickly it became irrelevant in one sense, but legendary in another. Within a year, these cars would be eclipsed by the fiberglass-bodied, tube chassis funny cars that were evolving directly out of them. The AWB cars were the missing link between the factory superstockers of the early 60s and the full-tilt funny cars of the late 60s. They existed in a brief, extraordinary window of time where factory racing had pushed so far into extremism that it had effectively created a new category of racing car. And NHRA's ban was the event that defined that moment. Car number 3, the 1965 Ford Mustang AFX with the 427's OHC camera. Now we come to Ford's side of this equation, and if the Chrysler AWB cars were radical in terms of chassis engineering, Ford's answer was radical in terms of engine technology, the 427's OHC engine. Universally known as the Camor, was one of the most extraordinary power plants ever dropped into a production-based race car. The Camor was Ford's response to the Hemi, and it was a completely different engineering philosophy. While the Hemi relied on hemispherical combustion chambers to improve breathing and combustion efficiency, the Camar used a single overhead cam on each bank of the V8, something that was absolutely unheard of in American production-based racing at the time. Single overhead cam technology was common in European racing, but in America it was exotic. It allowed for much better valve timing, much better high RPM performance, and significantly more power potential than a conventional pushrod V8. The engine had been developed originally with NASCAR in mind. Ford was going to put it in their full-size NASCAR stock cars and blow everyone away. Bill France Sr. saw it coming and banned it before it ever turned a lap in competition, reportedly because it was so far out. Side what NASCAR considered a production-based engine that allowing it would set a precedent nobody could control. So Ford was left holding this expensive, powerful, revolutionary engine with nowhere to race it except NHRA's AFX class. Gas Ronda was one of the first Ford factory drivers to campaign a Cammer-powered Mustang in AFX competition, and he won the 1965 NHRA Winter Nationals in the class, turning a 10.82 elapsed time at 128 miles per hour. That was a legitimate win at a legitimate NHRA national event, and it happened before the chaos of the mid-season really set in. The Mustang itself had been significantly modified for AFX duty. The hood was fiberglass. The front fenders were fiberglass. The weight had been reduced wherever possible. The wheelbase had been altered not to the extreme degree of the Chrysler AWB cars, but altered nonetheless to improve weight transfer at launch. And with the Camaro tuned for full race duty, these cars were producing somewhere in the region of 600 horsepower, which in a car that weighed around 3,000 pounds was a staggering power-to-weight ratio. The problem from NHRA's perspective was the same fundamental issue that had gotten the Chrysler cars banned. These were no longer factory cars in any meaningful sense. They were purpose-built racing machines that happened to wear Mustang bodies. And as NHRA continued to tighten its rules on what qualified for factory experimental competition, the Camaro Mustangs found themselves increasingly outside the lines. By mid-1965, the Ford-altered wheelbase cars, including the Camaro Mustangs, had been effectively moved out of NHRA competition. The combination of the wheelbase alterations, the non-production engine, and the fiberglass body components put them well outside what NHRA was now willing to sanction. But just like the Chrysler AWB cars, the Camaro Mustangs didn't disappear. They went to the match race circuit, where they were enormously popular. And there, without NHRA rule, less to constrain them, drivers began adding nitromethane to the fuel mixture, pushing power outputs even higher and elapsed times even lower. The Camaro Mustang was on its way to becoming a funny car, and it was going to be one of the most popular attractions in drag racing for years to come. Car number 4, the 1965 Mercury Comet AFX with the 427.0HC Camaro, while Gas Ronda was the most prominent of the Camaro Mustang pilots. Don Nicholson, universally known as Dino Don, was the most famous driver in the Camaro-powered Mercury Comet camp, and if you wanted a single name that defined what the 1965 AFX season meant for Ford Motor Company, that name was Dino Don Nicholson. Nicholson had been racing seriously since the late 1950s, and by 1965, he was one of the most respected competitors in drag racing. He was meticulous about preparation. He understood engines at a deep mechanical level, hence the nickname. And he was fast, consistently, repeatably, devastatingly fast. His 1965 Camaro Comet ran consistent mid-10-second times at speeds approaching 135 miles per hour. The Mercury Comet was a smaller, lighter platform than the full-size Fords, which made it an ideal candidate for AFX racing. With the Camaro installed, with fiberglass body panels reducing weight, and with an altered wheelbase improving launch traction, the car was a genuine threat to anything Chrysler was running. What made the Mercury Comet program particularly interesting was the level of factory support it received. Ford wasn't just handing Nicholson an engine and wishing him luck. This was a coordinated factory effort: engineering support, part supply, technical assistance. Mercury wanted wins. Mercury wanted the exposure. And Nicholson was delivering. There's a fascinating technical detail about these cars that often gets overlooked. The Mercury Comet AFX cars and the Mustang AFX cars were not the same vehicle with different bodies slapped on. They were different platforms with different i.e. GHT distributions, different suspension geometries, and different handling characteristics. The teams running Comets had to develop their cars independently from the teams running Mustangs, even though they were using the same basic engine. Nicholson's mechanical ability was a huge asset in this process. He could diagnose a handling problem or a power delivery issue in a way that most drivers simply couldn't. But like all the other factory AFX cars, the Comet found itself outside NHRA's increasingly strict rules as the season progressed. The wheelbase alterations, the fiberglass components, the non-standard engine, all of it put the Camaro Comet on the wrong side of the rulebook. And NHRA's message was clear. These cars are too extreme for our competition. What happened to Nicholson's Comet after the NHRA ban is one of the great evolution stories in drag racing history. Nicholson, like his Chrysler counterparts, took his car to the match race circuit, and then, understanding which way the wind was blowing, he began transitioning toward the emerging funny car format. By 1966, Nicholson was running a nitro-burning Comet with a flip-up fiberglass body that bore only cosmetic resemblance to a Mercury automobile. The match race star had become a funny car pioneer. The Mercury Comet AFX was the bridge between factory experimental racing and the wild, fire-breathing, nitromethane-fueled funny car era that was just around the corner. Car number 5, Mr. Norm's Grand Spalding Dodge SFX. Now, here's where the story gets really interesting, because while the first 4 cars on this list were all official, factory-backed, million-dollar programs run by professional teams with full manufacturer support, car number 5 was something different. Car number 5 was a dealer car. And the story behind it is one of the great entrepreneurial tales in drag racing history. Grand Spalding Dodge was a dealership in Chicago, Illinois. It was run by a man named Norm Kraus, who was known throughout the drag racing world by one of the greatest nicknames in the sport's history, Mr. Norm. Mr. Norm was not a factory racing program. He was a dealer. A very aggressive, very marketing savvy, very drag racing obsessed dealer who understood something that most of his contemporaries didn't, that racing wins sold cars. Not someday, not theoretically, right now. To the people who walked in the door. In 1965, Norm Kraus and his driver Gary Dyer did something audacious. They took a stock Dodge two-door right off the showroom floor of the Grand Spalding dealership. They altered the wheelbase, giving it that same forward weight bias that the factory AWB cars were using. They installed a gasser-style front axle, and then they dropped in a supercharged 426 Hemi. The result was a car that ran in the low 10-second range with gasoline, a number that put it right in the conversation with the factory cars. Dyer known as Sneaky Pete in some circles, though that nickname belongs. Jed to another racer drove the car on the match race circuit with a personality and a promotional flair that was pure Mr. Norm. Grand Spalding Dodge promoted itself aggressively around the car's performance. The idea was simple. If our dealer car can run with the factory race cars, imagine what we can do for your street car. It was brilliant marketing disguised as racing. The Mr. Norm SFX car operated in a slightly different world from the other 4 cars on this list, because while the Chrysler and Ford factory cars were specifically built for NHRA's AFX class, and were banned when NHRA changed its rules for that class, the Grand Spalding car was always going to be more of a match race, an outlaw circuit machine. It wasn't running the same official NHRA program as the factory cars, but it absolutely fell outside NHRA sanctioning rules, and when NHRA drew its lines, the Mr. Norm car was on the wrong side of them, just like everything else. What made the Grand Spalding Dodge so significant? Significant in the larger story was what it represented. The factory AWB cars were evidence of how far manufacturers would go in the pursuit of drag strip supremacy. The Mr. Norm car was evidence of how far that same philosophy had trickled down to the dealer level, to the entrepreneurial level, to the guy who was running a Dodge dealership in Chicago and decided that the best way to sell cars was to build a race car that would make people's jaws drop. Gary Dyer driving that Dodge through the traps at 10 seconds flat, announcing to anyone within earshot that this was a Grand Spalding Dodge that was marketing genius. And it was entirely consistent with the atmosphere of 1965, where every single person in the performance car world was trying to push the envelope as far as it would go. Here's what's important to understand about how the NHRA ban actually played out, because it wasn't a single, dramatic moment where an official walked up to 5 cars simultaneously and handed each TM a piece of paper. It was a process. A process that unfolded over the early months of the 1965 season and culminated in NHRA essentially locking out an entire generation of factory race cars. When NHRA officials first saw the Chrysler AWB cars, the reaction was visceral. These cars looked wrong. Not wrong in a broken way, wrong in the sense that they were clearly designed to exploit something. That front axle pushed so far forward that it was practically behind the front bumper. That rear axle moved so far up toward the middle of the car that the rear wheel wells were in completely the wrong position relative to the body. You didn't need to be an engineer to understand that Chrysler had taken the concept of factory experimental and pushed it to a place it was never supposed to go. The 2% wheelbase rule came down quickly and decisively, and when it landed, the Chrysler teams knew immediately what it meant. There was no gray area. There was no let's modify the cars slightly and see if they pass. The AWB Coronets and Belvederes were out. What happened next was fascinating. Rather than accepting the ban and going home, The Chrysler factory teams and their Ford counterparts, who were facing their own exclusion, effectively picked up their race cars and moved to a different world, the match race circuit. And in doing so, they didn't lose their audience. They found a bigger one. Match racing was everywhere in 1965. Tracks all across the country were booking these cars specifically because NHRA had banned them because the ban itself made them famous. A car that NHRA said was too radical was exactly the kind of car that fans wanted to see. The tracks were paying appearance fees. The teams were drawing enormous crowds. And without NHRA's rules constraining them, the cars were getting even faster and even more radical. Chrysler authorized fuel injection upgrades mid-season. By the time the AWB cars were running on the match race circuit with Hillborn Injectio, and they were deep into the 9-second range. SOX was recording 9-second passes in a full-bodied car. Those numbers had never been seen before in naturally aspirated, full-bodied competition. The car that NHRA said was too fast for their rules was now going even faster somewhere else. Ford's cars followed a similar trajectory. Dyno Don Nicholson, freed from the constraints of NHRA classification, started experimenting with fuel. Nitromethane found its way into his fuel mixture. The elapsed times dropped, the speeds went up. The fiberglass body on the Comet started to evolve, becoming more of a flip-up shell and less of an actual car body. Nicholson, whether he fully realized it at the time or not, was inventing the funny car. The NHRA ban of 1965 was one of those moments in motorsport history where a regulatory decision made to bring order to a chaotic situation accidentally launched an entirely new era of the sport. By saying, "These cars are too extreme for our rules," NHRA freed those cars to become something even more extreme, and the fans followed them. The 5 cars that NHRA banned in 1965 didn't fade into obscurity. They became the foundation of modern drag racing as we know it. The Chrysler AWB cars, the Plymouth Belvedere, and the Dodge Coronet were the direct ancestors of the funny car. Within a year of their NHRA ban, teams running cars derived from the AWB concept were using full fiberglass bodies that could be flipped up to expose the engine, tube-dash chassis frames that bore no relationship to production vehicles, and nitromethane fuel that produced power outputs the original AWB cars could only dream of. The funny car class became one of the most popular attractions in drag racing history. It still is. And it was born directly from NHRA's decision to ban the AWB Mopars. Ronnie Sox took his banned Plymouth to the match race circuit and became one of the most famous and beloved figures in the history of the sport. His shifting ability, that uncanny gift for perfectly executing manual transmission shifts under full power, made him a superstar even without NHRA wins. When NHRA created the Pro Stock class in 1970, Sox was ready. He and Buddy Martin dominated the early Pro Stock era, winning 9 of the first 15 national events held between 1970 and 1971 in what people in the sport still call the Sox and Martin juggernaut. The team that NHRA had pushed out in 1965 came back and became one of the greatest dynasties in drag racing history. Dick Landy continued developing the Hemi platform and became one of the most respected figures in Mopar performance history. He transitioned through the late 1960s and into the Pro Stock era, always bringing that technical precision and engineering knowledge that had defined his approach to the AWB cars. Dyno Don Nicholson made the transition to funny car and became one of the true pioneers of that class. His mechanical knowledge and his competitive instincts made him a force wherever he competed, and his influence on funny car development in the late 1960s was enormous. The Grand Spalding Dodge program, Mr. Norm's creation, continued to grow. Grand Spalding Dodge became one of the most famous performance dealerships in the country, and Norm Krause's philosophy of using racing to sell cars influenced a generation of dealers and performance shops. The idea that a dealership could be a genuine presence in motorsport, not just a sponsor but an actual competitor, was revolutionary for its time, and Ford's 427's OHC Camaro, the engine that neither NASCAR nor NHRA ultimately wanted in their competition, found its place in drag racing history as one of the great what-if engines. Teams that ran it on the match race circuit showed what it was capable of when the rules weren't there to constrain it. It never got to fulfill its original purpose in sanctioned competition, but its legacy in the sport is undeniable. What happened in 1965 was not just a story about 5 cars getting banned. It was a story about what happens when human ingenuity, corporate competition, and the relentless pursuit of speed all collide at the same moment in the same place. Every single person involved: the Chrysler engineers who designed the AWB cars, the Ford engineers who built the Camaro, the drivers who piloted these machines, the promoters who booked them, was operating at the absolute frontier of what was possible. They were building things that had never existed before, going speeds that had never been reached before. And they were doing it because winning mattered, because the stakes were real, and because they simply could not stop themselves from pushing further. NHRA drew a line. And rather than ending the story, that line redirected it. The band cars found a different stage. They went somewhere without lines, and what they became on that unregulated stage, the funny car, the pro stock car, the match racing legends, is the foundation of everything that Dr. Ag Racing has been for the last 60 years. 5 cars, 1 ruling. An entire era of motorsport born from a single moment of institutional pushback. That's 1965. And there has never been another season quite like it in the history of drag racing. If this story got you thinking about the other band legends of NHRA history, Bill Jenkins and his controversial Vega is a story you absolutely cannot miss. That's linked right up above. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time because there are a lot more stories like this one coming. See you in the next one.